You're not going to believe this story. It starts with a man, a woman, and a price tag. But where it ends, well, that's something else entirely. It was 1869 in the Oregon Territory, a place where the dust never settled and hope was a currency scarcer than gold. At an outpost that smelled of pine sap, stale whiskey, and desperation, a crowd of men gathered. They were miners, trappers, and loggers, men with calloused hands and hollow eyes, all staring at a makeshift stage. On that stage stood a woman, but you couldn't see her face. All you could see was a rough, burlap sack pulled down over her head, tied tight at the neck with a piece of frayed rope. Her hands were bound in front of her. She was barefoot, her feet coated in the grime of 1,000 merciless miles. The auctioneer, a man with a rusted deputy's badge pinned to a sweat-stained vest, slammed a gavel on a crate. "Last one for the day," he boomed, his voice cracking like dry leather. "She ain't got no name. Ain't shown her face since Missouri. Says she can work. Says she'll obey. We're starting the bid at $2. Who's man enough to marry a mystery?" A wave of cruel laughter rolled through the crowd. "Might be a witch under that thing," one man yelled. "Or a corpse," shouted another, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "Might as well marry the damn sack." The woman on the stage didn't move. She didn't flinch. The only sign she was even alive was the faint rhythmic rise and fall of her shoulders. She was breathing, fast and shallow, a prisoner inside her own body, inside that suffocating hood. Her fingers, just visible below the twine, twitched, clenched, released. The auctioneer grumbled, "She's no good to anyone if she won't even speak." No one stepped forward. The seconds stretched into a long, uncomfortable minute. The men shuffled their feet, some looking away, others smirking, waiting for the joke to end. And then, the crowd parted. From the back, a man walked forward. He was tall, with shoulders as broad as an oak tree, cutting a path through the lesser men like a ship through water. A worn black hat shadowed his face, but you could tell he was a man who spoke more to trees than to people. His canvas coat was faded, his boots caked in mud, and the handle of the axe tucked into his belt was wrapped in worn leather, smooth from the grip of his hand. He stopped before the stage. The world seemed to hold its breath. $2, he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the silence like a saw through timber. It wasn't angry or eager. It was just certain. The auctioneer squinted, caught off guard. "You sure, mister? You ain't even seen what you're buying." The tall man didn't look at the auctioneer. His gaze was fixed on the still, solitary figure on the platform. "I ain't buying a face," he said, his voice low and steady. "I'm marrying a person." The snickering stopped. The wind died down. Every eye was on this lumberjack, this stranger who had just paid $2 for a woman in a sack. Even the auctioneer seemed nervous now, fumbling with his papers. "Name," the auctioneer muttered, more to himself than anyone. "Silas Boone," the lumberjack said. "Profession?" "Lumberman, North Ridge." The auctioneer scribbled on a piece of paper, his hand shaking slightly. "Fine. Let it be known, Mr. Silas Boone has entered a lawful marital contract." He shoved the paper and a pen towards Silas, who signed his name in a single, clean stroke. Then the auctioneer turned to the woman. "You're legally wed, miss. State your name for the record." For a moment, there was nothing. Just the sound of the wind whispering through the ramshackle buildings. The sackcloth shifted slightly. The crowd leaned in, a collective intake of breath. And then a voice. It was so soft, so quiet, you had to strain to hear it. A whisper that felt like it had traveled across a frozen wasteland to reach them. "Annabelle. Crow." A gasp rippled through the crowd. Men took a step back, their eyes wide with something that looked like fear. The name Crow hung in the air like a bad omen, a name tied to dark whispers and fireside tales of bad luck and black magic. The Crows were a family spoken of in hushed tones, a clan from the eastern mountains rumored to walk a line between this world and the next. But it wasn't the crowd's reaction that mattered. It was Silas Boone's. He froze, utterly, completely still. It wasn't just the name. It was the voice. That soft, tired, impossibly familiar voice. A voice he hadn't heard in 3 years. A voice he thought he'd only ever heard in a fever dream, in the dead of winter, in a place between life and death. The auctioneer cleared his throat, eager to be done with this unsettling business. Right then, she's yours. Silas didn't move. His mind was a whirlwind, flashing back to a blizzard, to the taste of blood in his mouth, to the suffocating weight of snow. He remembered a fire in a dark cave and a faceless figure nursing him back from the brink of death. A figure who spoke in that exact same haunting whisper. He had spent 3 years wondering if she was real, and now she had a name, Annabelle Crow. He finally moved, stepping onto the platform. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at the auctioneer. He walked straight to her and, with a gentle but firm hand, took her arm. He didn't say a word. He just started walking, leading her away from the stage, away from the prying eyes and fearful whispers. No one dared to stop them. They just watched as the big lumberjack and his $2 bride with the cursed name and the sack on her head walked away from the outpost and disappeared into the deep, dark woods. But that wasn't the strangest part. The strangest part was the man who stepped out from the shadows of the saloon after they were gone. He was dressed in finer clothes than the others, with a cruel sneer on his face. He watched the direction Silas and Annabelle had gone, a flicker of pure hatred in his eyes. "So the little killer found herself a protector," he hissed to the man beside him. "Let her run. The crows always come home to roost." He turned and walked back into the saloon, leaving the crowd to wonder what they had just witnessed. They didn't know it yet, but they had just seen the opening move in a very dangerous game. And Annabelle Crow wasn't just hiding her face, she was hiding from a killer. The forest swallowed them whole. The trail narrowed, the towering pines blotting out the sun, casting long skeletal shadows across their path. It grew colder, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and secrets. Silas led the way, his old mule carrying the few meager supplies they'd been allowed. Annabelle followed a few paces behind, a silent ghost in his wake. She hadn't spoken another word. The sack remained firmly over her head. Every so often, the wind would catch it, and her hands would fly up to hold it in place, a frantic, desperate gesture. She was a phantom, and she wanted to stay that way. Silas didn't push. He didn't ask questions. He just walked, his hand resting near the handle of his axe, his eyes scanning the trees. He wasn't just looking at the path ahead. He was listening, watching. He could feel it in his bones, the same way he could feel an approaching storm. They were being followed. He caught a flicker of movement to his left, a shadow that didn't belong, then another to his right. Two men keeping their distance, but matching their pace. They weren't good at it. Their clumsy steps snapped twigs. Their dark coats stood out against the deep green of the forest. Amateurs. But amateurs with bad intentions were still dangerous. Silas didn't change his pace. He didn't let on that he knew. He just kept walking, his mind racing. Who were they? Why were they following them? Was it because of her name? Or something else? He had to lose them before they reached his cabin. His home was his sanctuary, the one place in the world he felt safe. He wouldn't lead trouble to his doorstep. He saw his chance up ahead, a fork in the trail. The main path was wide and easy. The other was a narrow, treacherous game trail that cut straight up the side of the ridge, a tangle of rocks and roots that only a fool or a madman would take. He was about to become a fool. Without a word of warning, Silas yanked the mule's lead, pulling it sharply onto the game trail. He grabbed Annabelle's arm, his grip strong but not painful. "Quickly," he whispered, his voice urgent, "and stay quiet." She stumbled, caught off guard but didn't cry out. She seemed to understand immediately, her body tensing. Together they scrambled up the steep incline, the mule groaning in protest. Behind them, Silas could hear shouts of surprise, then the sound of the men crashing through the undergrowth in pursuit. The chase was on. Silas knew these woods better than he knew the lines on his own hand. He moved with a speed and certainty that was terrifying, pulling Annabelle along with him. They ducked under low-hanging branches, leaped over fallen logs, their feet finding purchase on the slick, moss-covered rocks. The air burned in their lungs. The men behind them were closing in. They were clumsy, but they were determined. Silas could hear their curses, their heavy breathing. He had to do something drastic. He spotted a ravine ahead, spanned by a single massive fallen log. It was slick with rain and rot, a dangerous crossing. But it was their only way. "We cross here," he said, his voice tight. He led the mule onto the log first, its hooves clattering nervously on the slick bark. Then he turned to Annabelle. "Give me your hand." She hesitated for a heart-stopping second. She couldn't see. She was trusting a man she barely knew to lead her across a chasm, blind. But she reached out, her small, trembling hand finding his. He squeezed it. "I've got you," he said. And in that moment, she believed him. They were halfway across when a voice boomed from the trail behind them. "Stop right there, Boone!" Silas didn't stop. He pulled Annabelle faster. A loud crack echoed through the forest, and the air next to Silas's head exploded with splinters. A gunshot. They were shooting at them. Panic gave them wings. They scrambled the rest of the way across the log bridge, reaching the other side just as another shot rang out. Silas didn't wait. He grabbed his axe, and with three powerful, desperate swings, he chopped at the rotted base of the log. There was a groan, a splintering crack, and the massive log shuddered. Then, with a deafening roar, it tore free from the ravine edge and plunged into the darkness below, crashing against the rocks with a sound like thunder. They were safe, for now. Silas stood there, chest heaving, listening to the furious, impotent shouts of the men on the other side of the ravine. Then he turned to Annabelle. She was leaning against a tree, her whole body shaking. The sack was still on her head, but he could imagine the terror in her eyes. He had just saved her life. But in doing so, he had confirmed his worst fear. This wasn't about a name. This wasn't about bad luck. Annabelle Crow was a hunted woman, and by buying her, Silas had just painted a target on his own back. They reached the cabin as dusk was bleeding into night. It wasn't large, but it was solid, built from dark pine logs, with a strong stone chimney and a rusted horseshoe nailed over the door for luck. A stack of firewood stood neat and tall beside the door. It was a place of order and solitude, a place that had just been violated by the chaos of the outside world. Silas pushed the door open with a weary creak and stepped aside. "You pick where you stand," he said quietly, his voice rough with exhaustion. "No one's going to place you anymore." Annabelle stepped inside, her movements slow and cautious. She didn't explore. She didn't look around. She went straight to the farthest corner of the room, away from the door, away from the single window, and crouched down, her back to the wall. She made herself as small as possible, a bundle of fear in the shadows. She didn't remove the sack. Silas watched her for a moment, his heart aching with a feeling he couldn't name. Then he turned and went about his work. He built a fire in the hearth, the crackle and pop of the flames chasing away some of the oppressive silence. He filled a kettle with water and set it on the stove. He moved with a quiet efficiency, the familiar task grounding him. He didn't ask her who those men were. He didn't ask her why they were trying to kill her. He knew she wouldn't answer. Not yet. He made stew, the warm, savory scent of smoked meat and wild herbs filling the small cabin. He ladled it into two wooden bowls. He placed one on the small table for himself. The other he walked over and set on the floor near her. She flinched when he approached, pulling her knees tighter to her chest. He didn't say anything. He just left the bowl there and went back to the table to eat his own meal. He ate slowly, deliberately, not looking at her. The only sounds were the crackling fire and the clinking of his spoon against the bowl. Minutes passed. The steam rising from her bowl began to fade. He thought she wouldn't touch it. But then a small, muffled voice came from the corner. "Why?" Silas stopped chewing. He looked at his own bowl. "Why what? Why did you help me?" Her voice trembled. "You don't know me. You could have been killed back there. For $2. Silas set his spoon down. He looked over at her, a small, huddled shape in the gloom. "Because someone helped me once," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "When I was as good as dead. A stranger. I never saw their face, never knew their name. They saved my life and asked for nothing in return." He paused, the memory washing over him. "I guess I've been trying to pay that debt ever since." The silence that followed was different. It was less tense, less fearful. It was filled with a question she didn't dare ask. Slowly, carefully, she reached for the bowl. Her hands were shaking, but she gripped the spoon. She didn't remove the sack, but tilted her head and guided the spoon underneath the burlap. She ate in silence, and for the first time since he'd met her, she wasn't shaking. Later that night, long after the fire had died down to glowing embers, Silas sat by the hearth. Annabelle was asleep, or at least pretending to be, curled up on a bed of furs he'd laid out for her in the corner. He had given her the only bed, his own cot, but she had refused, preferring the floor, the corner, the shadows. The cabin was quiet, but Silas's mind was roaring. The chase through the woods, the gunshots, the terror in her posture. It all churned within him. But underneath it all was the voice, her voice. He closed his eyes and let the memory take him. 3 years ago, a winter so fierce it felt like the world was ending. The snow was piled 10 feet deep, and the cold was a physical thing, a beast with icy teeth that gnawed at your bones. He'd gone too far north for timber, pushed by pride and the need to outrun the ghosts of his past. He'd been alone, just him and his mule, when the blizzard hit. He lost the trail, got turned around. His mule slipped on a hidden patch of ice, fell, and broke its leg. He'd had to put the poor creature out of its misery, a single shot that was swallowed by the howling wind. Now he was truly alone, and lost. He'd wandered for what felt like days, the cold seeping into him, his leg twisted and throbbing from a fall. He finally collapsed in a snowbank, the fight draining out of him. He was ready to die. He closed his eyes, welcoming the quiet, the numbness. But then, hands, rough, small hands, pulling at him, dragging him. He remembered the pain, the jarring sensation of being pulled over frozen ground. Then darkness. He awoke to the smell of fire and boiling bark. He was in a small cave, shielded from the wind by a curtain of frozen snow. A fire crackled beside him, casting dancing shadows on the rock walls. His injured leg had been expertly splinted and wrapped. Across the fire sat a figure, a woman. He couldn't see her face. It was covered by a thick wool scarf and a hood, shielding her from the cold and from his gaze. She moved with a quiet, practiced grace, tending to him, feeding him a bitter, hot tea made from pine bark and lichen. She had spoken to him, her voice a soft, tired whisper, the same whisper he had heard on the auction block. "You don't need to know who I am," she had said, "but I'm not going to let you die out here." He tried to speak, to thank her, but his throat was raw, his lips cracked. He could only manage a croak. She had stayed with him through the night, keeping the fire alive, forcing more of the bitter tea down his throat. She saved his life. When he awoke again, the sun was casting a pale blue light into the cave. She was gone. The only things she left behind were a small stack of firewood, a cup of water, and something else. Something folded neatly on the rock beside him. It was a small square of cloth, like a piece torn from a handkerchief. In the center, embroidered with uneven purple thread, were 3 tiny, misshapen flowers. A strange, personal token. He had kept it ever since. It was in his coat pocket right now. A talisman. A reminder of the faceless angel who had pulled him back from the grave. He opened his eyes, the firelight in the cabin dancing in his vision. He glanced over at the sleeping form in the corner. Annabelle Crow. The woman with the cursed name and the hidden face. The woman with the voice of his savior. It couldn't be a coincidence. It was impossible. But then, as his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he saw something that made the air freeze in his lungs. One of her hands was resting outside the fur blanket, and on the back of that hand, just above the knuckle, was a tattoo. It was faded and crudely done, but unmistakable in the flickering firelight. It was a small black crow in flight. The whispers about her family, the Crow clan, suddenly felt very real. But that wasn't what stunned him. It was the memory it triggered, a detail he had long forgotten from that cave. As the mysterious woman had tended to his leg, her sleeve had ridden up for just a second, revealing her wrist. And on that wrist, he had seen a flash of dark ink. The same tattoo, the same black crow. It was her. There was no doubt anymore. The woman he had just bought, The woman being hunted by killers was the same woman who had saved his life 3 years ago. He had just married his guardian angel, and she had no idea that he knew. The next morning the forest was eerily quiet. A thick mist clung to the ground, muffling all sound, making the world outside the cabin feel unreal. Silas was up before dawn, oiling his saw, the rhythmic scrape of metal on the stone the only sound. His mind was a storm of questions. Why was she hiding? Who was she running from? And why, after saving his life, had she ended up on an auction block? Annabelle emerged from the cabin as the first hint of sun began to pierce the fog. She moved like a deer, cautious and silent. The sack was still on her head. She walked to the edge of the clearing and just stood there, facing the trees, as if gathering the courage to face the day. Silas decided he couldn't wait any longer. He had to know. He stopped his work, the sudden silence hanging heavy in the air. "I got hurt once," he said, his voice calm and even, not looking at her directly. "Badly. Up on Black Ridge. Deep winter. Should have died out there." He saw her shoulders tense. She didn't turn. "Someone found me," he continued, his voice dropping lower. "Pulled me into a cave. Saved my life. They wore a sack over their head, just like that one. Wouldn't say their name. Barely let me see their hands." He paused, letting the words sink in. Then he turned his head just slightly, his gaze finding her still form. "But I remember their voice," he said. "Your voice sounds just like theirs." The stillness that followed was absolute. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting. Annabelle stood frozen for a long, agonizing moment. Silas thought maybe he had pushed too hard, that she would retreat back into her shell of silence forever. But then something happened. A sound. The soft, scratching sound of fabric sliding over skin. He didn't move. He didn't even breathe. He just watched as her hands rose slowly, deliberately, to the knot behind her neck. She fumbled with it for a second, her fingers trembling. Then the knot came loose. The sack didn't fall. She held it for a moment, then with a deep, shuddering breath, she pulled it off, and she turned to face him. Her face wasn't monstrous. It wasn't deformed. It was the face of a young woman, with high cheekbones and wide, haunted eyes the color of a stormy sky. But it was a face that bore a terrible story. A long, curved scar, puckered and white against her skin, ran from her right temple down to the line of her jaw. It was an old wound, but a vicious one, a mark of violence that could never be erased. She met his gaze, her chin held high, no longer hiding. She was bare, vulnerable, and yet there was a fire in her eyes, a flicker of defiance that hadn't been there before. "The man who ran the boarding house where I worked," she began, her voice a raw whisper. "Mr. Ridley. He told me I could keep my room if I offered him extras." She swallowed hard, the memory twisting her face. "I said no. He didn't like that." She looked down for a second, then her eyes snapped back to his, sharp and fierce. "He came at me. He was drunk, angry. I fought back. I pushed him. He slipped. His head hit the corner of the iron stove." Her voice broke on the last word. "He died, instantly." Silas's jaw tightened, a muscle flexing in his cheek. He said nothing, letting her speak. "I ran," she whispered. "I was terrified, but his son, Jedediah, he found me. He didn't listen. He told everyone I killed his father on purpose, that I lured him in, tried to rob him. They called me a liar, a temptress, a killer." Her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "There were no witnesses, no one to speak for me. So Jedediah, he didn't take me to the law. He said he'd pass his own sentence." Her eyes looked past Silas now into a darkness he could only imagine. "He and his men, they sold me, passed me from one cruel hand to another to pay off his father's supposed debts. They put the sack on my head, said it made me easier to sell. It made me nothing." She looked down at the burlap sack clutched in her hands. "I kept wearing it, even when I got away from them. It was easier. People don't look at you. They don't judge you if they can't see you. They don't see the scar and decide what you are before you even speak." She looked up at him again, her eyes shining with unshed tears, but her voice was steady. I didn't ask to be saved. I didn't ask to be bought. But I am so tired of hiding. Silas finally moved. He stood up, wiping his oily hands on a rag. He walked towards her, stopping a few feet away. He didn't reach for her. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He just looked at her face, at her scar, and saw not a victim, but a survivor. Thank you, he said, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't quite decipher. For telling me. She blinked, confused. Why are you thanking me? He took a step closer, and then he did something she never expected. He gently reached out and touched his own cheek, tracing a line on his own skin that mirrored her scar. Because now I understand, he said softly. She stared at him, bewildered. Understand what? Silas dropped his hand. His eyes were filled with a strange, dark light. I have a scar too, Annabelle. Not on my face, but on my soul. He paused and his voice dropped to a near whisper. The man you killed, Mr. Ridley. I knew him. Annabelle's blood ran cold. The world tilted on its axis. You knew him? Silas nodded slowly. He wasn't just a boarding house owner. He was my business partner. And the day he died was the day my wife was murdered. The forest spun. Annabelle felt the ground disappear from beneath her feet. This couldn't be happening. It was a nightmare. The man who had just saved her, the man she was starting to trust, was connected to the very event that had destroyed her life. Your wife? She stammered. Her name was Alara, Silas said, his voice hollow. She was killed on the road just outside of town, robbed and left for dead. The same day Ridley died. The law said it was drifters, but I never believed it. His eyes, hard as stone, bored into hers. Ridley and we had a disagreement about money, a lot of money. Money that went missing right after he died. He took another step closer, his shadow falling over her. You said there were no witnesses to what happened in that room, Annabelle. But maybe there was one. Her heart hammered against her ribs. What are you talking about? You said you pushed him. He hit his head. It was an accident. Silas's voice was dangerously low. But what if it wasn't an accident? What if someone else was in that room with you? Someone who saw their chance. Someone who finished the job you started and made it look like you were the killer? He was standing right in front of her now, his presence overwhelming. The kind stranger was gone, replaced by a man with a darkness in his eyes that mirrored her own. What if the man who murdered my wife, Silas breathed, the words hanging like a death sentence in the cold morning air, is the same man you've been running from all this time? Jedediah Ridley. The world shattered. It wasn't just a lie she was running from anymore. It wasn't just a false accusation. It was a conspiracy, a murder, a missing fortune, and she was standing right in the middle of it. Silas hadn't just bought a bride. He had bought the only witness to his wife's murder, and neither of them had known it until now. The air in the cabin grew thick and heavy, charged with the weight of their shared, terrible history. Annabelle couldn't speak. She could barely breathe. Silas's revelation had ripped open a wound she thought couldn't get any deeper and poured salt right into it. Jedediah. The name was a venomous snake coiling in her gut. His face, twisted with false grief and greedy ambition, flashed in her mind. He told everyone I did it for money, she finally managed to whisper, her voice trembling. He said I was trying to rob his father. And the money was never found, Silas finished for her, his eyes blazing with a cold fire. Because he took it. He killed my Alara for it. And he used you, your fight, your fear. He used your life as the perfect cover story. It was a puzzle falling into place, each piece more horrifying than the last. She wasn't just a scapegoat. She was the linchpin of a monstrous lie, a lie that had allowed Jedediah to get away with murder and theft. The men who had chased them through the forest, they were his men. Jedediah wasn't just trying to silence her. He was trying to erase the last loose thread of his crime. A new strength, forged in the fires of this fresh rage, began to burn within her. The fear was still there, but now it had a companion, a deep, primal need for justice. Not just for herself, but for the woman she had never met, Alara. That night she didn't sleep in the corner. When Silas offered her the cot, she took it. It was a small act, but it was a declaration. She was done hiding in the shadows. Over the next few days, a strange partnership formed between them. The silence was replaced by questions, by whispered plans in the dead of night. Silas would tell her about Alara, his voice soft with love and grief. He described her kindness, her laugh, the sea-green silk scarf she always wore. Annabelle, in turn, told him everything she could remember about that night, every detail about Ridley, about the boarding house, about the way Jedediah's eyes had gleamed when he saw his father's body. They were two broken people, bound together by a shared enemy, and slowly, carefully, they began to forge a weapon out of their pain. One morning, Annabelle was sitting at the small table, staring into a tin cup of coffee, when she noticed something new. Propped against a wedge of pine was a small, silver-framed mirror. It was old, the edges tarnished, but the glass was clean and clear. Beside it lay a scarf, carefully folded. A scarf of faded sea-green silk. Ilara's scarf. Her breath caught in her throat. She looked up at Silas, who was standing by the stove, his back to her. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. It was a gift, an offering, a gesture of trust that spoke louder than any words. She slowly reached for the mirror. For the first time, she truly looked at herself, not with shame or fear, but with a clinical detachment. She saw the scar, yes, a permanent map of her trauma, but she also saw the strength in her own eyes, the resilience. She saw a survivor. Then she picked up the scarf. It was soft as a whisper, cool against her skin. With steady hands, she wrapped it around her head, letting the soft fabric drape artfully over her scar. It didn't hide it completely, but it softened it. It framed her face, drawing attention not to the wound, but to her eyes. It was a shield, but a different kind. Not a burlap sack of shame, but a silken banner of choice. She had taken control of her own image. She looked at her reflection. A new woman looked back. "It suits you," Silas said quietly from across the room. She turned to him, a small, fragile smile touching her lips for the first time. "Thank you." But their fragile peace was about to be shattered. Trouble didn't ride this time. It arrived in the form of a poster, nailed to the general store's message board in the nearby logging town. Silas saw it when he went in for supplies. "Wanted." The word was printed in big black letters. Underneath was a crude but recognizable drawing of a woman with a scar on her right cheek. "For the murder of Alastair Ridley, $500 reward issued by Jedediah Ridley." Below the drawing, it described her as armed, dangerous, and a known associate of the notorious Crow clan. Rumored practitioners of dark arts. Jedediah wasn't just hunting her with thugs anymore. He had made it official. He had turned every desperate man in the territory into a potential enemy. He had put a price on her head. Silas ripped the poster from the board, his hands shaking with fury. He knew what this meant. They couldn't hide in the cabin forever. Jedediah had raised the stakes. Now it wasn't just a matter of survival, it was a race. They had to find proof of Jedediah's guilt before a bounty hunter's bullet found Annabelle. He returned to the cabin, his face a grim mask. He showed her the poster. She stared at it, her face draining of color. The drawing was a cruel caricature, making her look like a monster. "He will never stop," she whispered, her voice hollow. "No," Silas agreed, his voice hard as iron. "He won't, which is why we have to stop him first." "How, Silas? It's my word against his. He has money, influence. I have nothing." "You have me," he said fiercely, "and you have the truth. We just need to find a way to prove it." He began to pace the small cabin, his mind working furiously. There has to be something. Someone who saw something. Someone who knows something. Annabelle racked her brain, thinking back to the boarding house. It was a place of transient people, drifters, lonely workers. But there was one person, a quiet woman who worked in the kitchen, a woman with kind, sad eyes who had always avoided trouble. "Mavis," Annabelle breathed. Mavis Green. She was the cook. She was there that night. She must have heard something. Where is she now? Silas asked, his eyes sharp. I I don't know. After I ran, I heard Jedediah fired everyone. He didn't want anyone left who knew his father, who might ask questions. It was a long shot, a ghost from the past, but it was the only shot they had. Finding Mavis Green was now their only hope, but they weren't the only ones looking for a witness. That night, a new player entered the game. A man rode into the logging town, a man who moved with the chilling stillness of a wolf. He was lean and wiry, with eyes as gray and cold as a winter sky. He called himself Cutter, and he was a bounty hunter, the best and the most ruthless in the territory. He didn't go to the saloon. He didn't ask questions. He went straight to the general store, looked at the empty space on the message board where the poster had been, and a slow, cruel smile spread across his face. So, he murmured to the wind, someone's trying to hide the prize. Cutter wasn't just after the $500. He had been hired privately by Jedediah, with a much larger sum promised for a very specific task. Bring back Annabelle Crow, dead or alive. Preferably dead. He looked towards the dark silhouette of North Ridge. He could smell fear on the wind. The hunt had begun. And for Cutter, the hunt was everything. He found their trail within a day. He was no clumsy thug. He was a predator. He moved through the forest like a ghost, silent and unseen. He found the ravine where Silas had dropped the log, and he just smiled. A clever trick, but it only told him one thing. His quarry was smart. That made the hunt more interesting. He didn't attack the cabin directly. That was for amateurs. Instead, he began a campaign of psychological warfare. One morning, Silas and Annabelle awoke to find a dead crow hanging from the horseshoe above their door, its neck broken. Annabelle stifled a scream, her hand flying to her mouth. The crow was a symbol of her family, her name. This was a message, brutal and direct. I know who you are. I am coming for you. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced the fragile courage they had built. The forest no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a cage, with a predator circling just outside the bars. They were trapped. He's playing with us, Silas growled, his hand gripping the handle of his axe so tightly his knuckles were white. He wants us to panic, to run. Then we can't, Annabelle said, her voice surprisingly firm. The sight of the dead bird, a desecration of her name, had ignited something in her. The fear was still there, but it was being burned away by a white-hot rage. We can't run. We have to fight. But how do you fight a ghost? Cutter was everywhere and nowhere. They would find tracks near the stream, a broken twig on a path they had just used. He was always watching. The feeling of being constantly observed, of being hunted, began to wear on them, fraying their nerves, turning every shadow into a threat. They knew they couldn't stay in the cabin. It was a death trap. Their only chance was to split up. Silas would head to the nearest town with a real sheriff, a place called Silver Creek, and try to find any information he could on Mavis Green's whereabouts. Annabelle would have to disappear. You'll go east, Silas said, spreading a worn map on the table. Through the Whisper Wood. It's dense, treacherous, easy to get lost in if you don't know it. But there are old trappers' shelters scattered throughout. You can hide there. He'll follow me, Annabelle said. It wasn't a question. I know, Silas replied grimly. That's the point. You have to lead him on a chase. Keep him occupied. Buy me time to find Mavis. It was a terrifying plan. She would be alone, with a professional killer on her trail. But then Annabelle had an idea so audacious, so dangerous, it just might work. She went to the old wooden chest at the foot of the cot. She reached inside and pulled out the burlap sack. It was folded neatly, a relic of a life she thought she had left behind. She held it in her hands. I'll wear it again, she said, her voice quiet but resolute. Silas looked at her, his brow furrowed. You don't have to do that. Her eyes met his, and for the first time he saw not a hint of fear in them, only a cold, hard resolve. Yes, I do. This time I choose it. Not for shame, for strategy. Her lips curved into a bitter smile. He's hunting the girl with the scar. But I'll give him the ghost in the sack. Let him chase a phantom. She would become the creature of rumor, the nameless, faceless mystery. She would use the very thing that had been her prison as her weapon. At dawn, as the sky turned a bruised purple, she mounted Silas's second horse. The burlap sack was pulled tight over her head. She looked like a specter, a nightmare born from the misty woods. She looked at Silas, her hidden face turned towards him. "Find her, Silas," her muffled voice came from beneath the sack. "Be safe, Annabelle," he replied, his heart a leaden weight in his chest. She nodded once, then spurred her horse, disappearing into the mist-shrouded trees of the Whisperwood. Silas watched until she was gone. Then he turned and rode west, towards Silver Creek, towards a ghost of his own. The fate of two lives now rested on a desperate gamble, a woman leading a killer through a forest of shadows, and a man chasing a memory in a town full of strangers. And the clock was ticking. The Whisperwood lived up to its name. The wind sighed through the ancient moss-draped trees, creating a constant rustling whisper that sounded like voices just on the edge of hearing. It was a disorienting, unnerving place. For Annabelle, blind beneath the sack, it was a sensory nightmare. She had to rely entirely on her horse, on the feel of the terrain beneath its hooves, and on the faint trail markers Silas had taught her to recognize. But the sack, her former prison, was now her greatest asset. Cutter, following close behind, wasn't hunting a person. He was hunting a legend. The local loggers and trappers he passed spoke of a ghost woman who haunted the woods, a faceless omen. His arrogance made him believe he was above such foolish superstition. But the image of the lone, sacked figure riding through the mist unnerved him more than he would admit. It was unnatural, and it made him careless. He was focused on the sack, on the myth. He wasn't looking for the subtle signs of a clever woman laying a trap. Annabelle wasn't just fleeing, she was thinking. She remembered everything Silas had taught her about the woods. She used his tricks. She doubled back on her own trail, laid false paths leading to dead ends, and used the whispering wind to mask the sound of her movements. She was no longer prey. She was a ghost, leading her hunter deeper and deeper into a labyrinth of her own design. She led him towards Deadfall Canyon, a treacherous maze of ravines and rock slides. It was a place locals avoided, a place where the ground was unstable, and the whispers of the forest sounded like warnings. It was the perfect place for a trap. Meanwhile, Silas rode into Silver Creek. It was a bigger, more established town, with a proper sheriff's office and a sense of order Northridge lacked. But it was also a place where secrets were currency. He started his search in the saloons and boarding houses, asking after a cook named Mavis Green. The name drew blank stares and suspicious glares. People in these parts didn't like strangers asking questions. After a day of dead ends, his hope began to dwindle. Mavis could be anywhere. She could be dead. He was about to give up for the day when an old grizzled blacksmith he was talking to paused, his hammer hovering over a red-hot horseshoe. "Mavis Green?" he grunted. "Knew a Mavis once. Quiet woman, scared of her own shadow. Used to work up at the Ridley place before that whole ugly business." Silas's heart leaped. "That's her. Do you know where she went?" The blacksmith shook his head. "Vanished. But I heard she had family. A sister, I think. Over on the coast in a fishing town called Port Promise. It's a long ride from here." It was a sliver of a chance, but it was more than he'd had. Port Promise. He had a destination. But as he turned to leave, the blacksmith grabbed his arm. His eyes were serious. "A word of advice, friend. You're not the first person to come around asking about Mavis Green." A chill went down Silas's spine. "Who else?" "A man came through a week ago, a fancy man in a city coat, Jedediah Ridley. He was asking about her, too, and he didn't sound like he wanted to send her a Christmas card." The race had just become infinitely more dangerous. Jedediah wasn't just relying on Cutter. He was actively hunting down and eliminating any other potential witnesses. Silas had to get to Mavis before Jedediah did. He rode out of Silver Creek like a man possessed, pushing his horse to its limit. It was a 2-day ride to the coast, 2 days where anything could happen. Back in the Whisperwood, Annabelle's plan was reaching its climax. She had led Cutter to the edge of Deadfall Canyon. She dismounted, leaving her horse as bait, and scrambled up a high, narrow ledge that overlooked the trail. From here, she could see the whole canyon spread out below her. She had prepared her trap. Hours earlier, she had used Silas's axe to weaken the base of a precariously balanced pile of rocks and dead logs that loomed over the narrowest part of the trail. A single, well-placed push was all it would take to send a thundering avalanche of rock and timber down onto the path below. She waited, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The sack was hot and suffocating, but she didn't dare remove it. Finally, she saw him. Cutter appeared on the trail below, moving with his signature wolf-like grace. He saw her horse riderless, and a smug smile touched his lips. He thought he had her cornered. He dismounted and started walking towards the horse, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. He was right below her now. Now! Annabelle threw her entire weight against the key log. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then, with a deep groan, the entire pile shifted. It started slowly, a few pebbles skittering down, and then the whole thing gave way with a deafening roar. Cutter looked up, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief. The smug smile was gone, replaced by pure terror. He was fast, but he wasn't fast enough. The landslide, a crushing wave of rock and splintered wood, crashed down onto the trail, burying him completely. Silence descended. The only sound was the settling of dust and the panicked whinny of her horse. Annabelle stood on the ledge, shaking, gasping for breath. She had done it. She had faced her monster and won. Slowly, she reached up and pulled off the sack. The fresh, cool air on her face felt like a rebirth. She looked down at the pile of rubble that was Cutter's tomb. She felt no remorse, only a grim, cold satisfaction. But as the dust settled, she saw something that made her blood run cold. A hand, reaching up from the rubble. Cutter was alive. He clawed his way out of the rocks, his body battered and bleeding, his fine coat torn to shreds. One of his arms hung at a useless angle, clearly broken. But he was alive, and the look on his face was no longer human. It was the face of a cornered animal, filled with pure, murderous rage. His pistol was gone, buried under the rocks. But in his good hand, he clutched a long, wicked-looking hunting knife. He saw her standing on the ledge above him, her face finally revealed, the scar stark in the afternoon light. "Crow," he snarled, his voice a broken rasp. He started climbing the rock face towards her, his one good arm pulling him up, his eyes burning with a promise of a slow, painful death. She was trapped. There was nowhere to run. She looked around frantically, her eyes landing on the axe she had used, lying on the ledge beside her. It was her only chance, her only weapon. She had never held an axe as a weapon before, but she was Silas Boone's wife, and she was a survivor. She picked it up. It felt heavy, unfamiliar in her hands. But as Cutter's snarling face appeared over the edge of the ledge, she raised it high, her fear replaced by a final, desperate surge of adrenaline. This fight wasn't over yet. The port town was a world away from the forest. The air tasted of salt and rotting fish, and the cries of gulls replaced the whisper of the wind. Silas found Mavis Green in a small, weathered shack near the docks, mending fishing nets with her sister. Her face was etched with a permanent look of worry, and when she saw Silas standing in her doorway, a stranger with a grim face, she nearly bolted. "Mavis Green?" he asked, his voice gentle, trying not to spook her. Her eyes darted around, looking for an escape. "Who's asking?" "My name is Silas Boone. I need to talk to you about Annabelle Crow." At the mention of the name, all the color drained from Mavis's face. She started shaking her head, backing away. "I don't know anyone by that name. You have the wrong person." "Please," Silas pleaded, taking a step inside. "She's in terrible danger. Jedediah Ridley is trying to kill her. He's hired a bounty hunter." "Then you should leave," Mavis whispered, her voice trembling. "He'll kill anyone who talks. I saw what he's capable of." "What did you see, Mavis?" Silas pressed, his voice low and urgent. "Annabelle told me you were there that night. She needs your help. She needs someone to tell the truth." Tears welled in Mavis's eyes. "The truth?" she said, her voice cracking. "The truth is that I was a coward. I hid in the pantry when I heard the shouting. I heard the crash. I heard everything." She looked down at her hands, ashamed. When it went quiet, I peeked out. I saw Mr. Ridley on the floor, and I saw Jedediah. He was standing over his father's body, holding a bloody iron poker from the fireplace. Silas's blood ran cold. Annabelle's push hadn't killed Ridley. It had only stunned him. Jedediah had delivered the killing blow. He saw me, Mavis continued, her voice barely audible. He looked right at me. He didn't say a word. He just smiled. And I knew. I knew if I ever said a word, I would be next. So I ran. I ran as far as I could. This was it. The proof. The final piece of the puzzle. You have to come back with me, Mavis, Silas urged. You have to tell the sheriff what you saw. No, she cried, backing away again. He'll find me. He'll kill me. Just then, the door to the shack burst open. Two burly men, dock workers with cruel faces, filled the doorway. Behind them, stepping out of the shadows, was Jedediah Ridley. He was dressed in a fine city coat, but his face was twisted into an ugly sneer. Well, well, Jedediah said, his voice dripping with false charm. It seems my little witness has been found. And look, you've brought a friend, the lumbering husband. How convenient. Silas pushed Mavis behind him, placing himself between her and the intruders. His hand went to the axe on his belt. Jedediah chuckled. An axe against two men with guns? You woodsmen are all alike. All brawn. No brains. He nodded to his men. Take them. We'll have a nice long chat down by the water. The tide is coming in. The two thugs advanced into the small shack. Silas knew he couldn't fight them both. Not in this cramped space. It was a death trap. He was out of time and out of options. Back at Deadfall Canyon, the fight was brutal and primal. Annabelle swung the heavy axe, the force of it jarring her arms. Cutter, fueled by rage and pain, was terrifyingly fast, even with only one good arm. He dodged her clumsy swing and lunged, his knife flashing. The blade sliced across her arm, and she cried out, stumbling back. The scent of her own blood filled her nostrils, sharp and metallic. He came at her again, his face a mask of hate. She was no match for him in a fight. He was a professional killer. She was just a woman who had been pushed too far. But she had one advantage. He thought she was just a scared girl. He underestimated her. As he lunged for the killing blow, she did the one thing he didn't expect. She didn't try to block him. She dropped the axe and threw herself to the side, rolling across the rocky ground. Cutter, caught off balance, stumbled past her, his momentum carrying him right to the edge of the ledge. He teetered there for a second, his good arm flailing for balance. Annabelle saw her chance. She scrambled to her feet, grabbed the discarded axe, and with a final, desperate scream that was part rage and part terror, she didn't swing it at him. She threw it. The heavy axe spun end over end, not a skillful throw, but a lucky one. The blunt end of the handle slammed into Cutter's chest with a sickening thud. It wasn't enough to kill him, but it was enough to knock him off balance. He yelled a short, sharp cry of surprise as he tumbled backward over the edge of the cliff. His scream echoed through the canyon as he fell, finally ending with a distant, final crash. Silence. Annabelle stood on the ledge, her chest heaving, her arm bleeding freely. She stared at the spot where he had been, then down into the chasm where he had fallen. She had survived. Against all odds, she had survived. She tore a strip of cloth from her dress and tied a makeshift bandage around her arm, the pain sharp and clean. The adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion. But she knew she couldn't rest. Silas was still out there. Mavis was still missing. Jedediah was still free. She had won the battle, but the war was far from over. She retrieved her horse and, without a backward glance, rode out of Deadfall Canyon, leaving the ghost behind. She had to get back. She had to find Silas. The fight in the fisherman's shack was a blur of motion. Silas kicked over a table, sending it crashing into the legs of one of Jedediah's thugs. He used the brief opening to shove Mavis toward the shack's only other exit, a small back window. "Go! Run!" he yelled, but Jedediah was too quick. He grabbed a heavy iron skillet from the wall and swung it, catching Silas in the side of the head. The world exploded in a flash of white-hot pain. Silas staggered, his vision blurring. The two thugs were on him in an instant, pinning his arms, Wrestling the axe from his belt, Jedediah walked over, the cruel smile back on his face. He looked down at Silas, who was now on his knees, struggling against the two men. "You should have stayed in your forest, lumberjack," Jedediah sneered. "You had no part in this, but you chose to play the hero, and heroes always end up dead." He raised the iron skillet, preparing to deliver the final blow. Mavis screamed. Suddenly, the front door, which had swung partially shut, was kicked wide open. Annabelle stood there, framed in the doorway like an avenging angel. Her face was smudged with dirt and blood, her arm was bandaged, and in her hand she held Cutter's long, wicked hunting knife, which she must have retrieved from his body. Her eyes were chips of ice, burning with a cold, righteous fury. Jedediah froze, the skillet held aloft, his mouth agape in utter shock. You're supposed to be dead." Annabelle took a step into the room. "Your man failed," she said, her voice low and dangerous, a sound that sent a shiver down everyone's spine. "Now you have to deal with me." The two thugs, seeing the look in her eyes, the blood on her clothes and the deadly knife in her hand, hesitated. This was not the frightened girl they had been told about. This was something else entirely. That moment of hesitation was all Silas needed. With a roar of effort, he surged upwards, throwing off the surprised thugs. He lunged for Jedediah, tackling him to the ground. The skillet went flying, clattering across the floor. It was chaos. The thugs scrambled to help Jedediah. Annabelle moved like a whirlwind, her knife flashing, keeping them at bay. Mavis, seeing her chance, grabbed the heavy skillet from the floor. Her fear was gone, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated rage. She had been a coward for too long. As one of the thugs turned on Annabelle, Mavis swung the skillet with all her might, connecting with the side of his head with a loud metallic clang. He crumpled to the floor, out cold. The other thug, seeing his partner go down and facing a furious Silas and a knife-wielding Annabelle, decided he wasn't being paid enough. He turned and fled out the door. Now it was just them and Jedediah. Silas hauled a sputtering, panicked Jedediah to his feet. "It's over, Jedediah," Silas growled. Mavis saw everything. Jedediah's eyes darted between them, looking for an escape. He was a cornered rat. "You have no proof. It's her word against mine." "Oh, I think we have more than her word," Annabelle said, her voice like ice. She gestured with the knife towards Mavis. "Mavis wasn't just the cook, was she, Jedediah? She also helped your father with his books. She knows where the money went. She knows about the secret ledger." The color drained from Jedediah's face. He looked at Mavis, his eyes wide with disbelief and horror. You knew?" Mavis nodded, her expression grim. "Alistair was a cheat and a thief, but he was meticulous. He wrote everything down. I know where he kept it." It was the final nail in his coffin. With Mavis's testimony in the ledger, Jedediah was finished. They marched him to the Port Promise sheriff, a man who, unlike the law in North Ridge, was not in Jedediah's pocket. The evidence was overwhelming. Jedediah Ridley was arrested for the murders of his father and Alara Boone. As they watched him being led away in chains, a sense of quiet, profound relief settled over them. It was finally over. Silas turned to Annabelle. He looked at her, truly looked at her, at the dirt on her face, the blood on her arm, the fire in her eyes. He gently reached out and touched her scar, his thumb tracing the line of it with a reverence that made her breath catch. "You saved me," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Again." She leaned into his touch, a real, genuine smile finally reaching her eyes. "I guess that makes us even." They had faced down killers, conspiracies, and their own ghosts. They had found justice not in a courtroom, but in their own strength and in each other. Spring came to North Ridge, washing the world clean. The forest, once a place of fear and shadow, felt like home. Silas, with help from the old blacksmith, built a simple wooden arch at the edge of the clearing, where wildflowers were beginning to bloom. There was no priest, no fancy ceremony, just a few friends. Mavis was there, her face no longer haunted by fear. The blacksmith and his wife came, bringing bread and apple brandy. It wasn't many, but it was enough. Annabelle stood inside the cabin, looking at her reflection in the small, silver-framed mirror. She wore a simple cream-colored dress she had stitched herself, and on her head she wore a veil. It was made from the burlap sack. Silas had washed it, sun-dried it, and carefully cut it into a delicate veil. The edges were hemmed with fine white thread, and in the corners, Annabelle herself had embroidered tiny purple wildflowers, just like the ones on the handkerchief she had left him in the cave all those years ago. She had taken the symbol of her shame, her prison, and transformed it into a symbol of her triumph. When she stepped out of the cabin, the forest seemed to fall silent. Silas stood under the arch, his breath catching in his throat. He saw not the scar, not the veil, but the woman, the strong, brave, incredible woman who had fought her way back from the darkness. She walked towards him, and as she reached him, he took her hands in his. "No matter what covered your face," he said, his voice low and steady, "for her alone. You were always the woman I chose, and now you are the woman I vow to stand beside until the end." A tear traced a clean path through the dust on her cheek. "And I vow the same," she whispered. They sealed their vows with a soft, sure kiss as the wind rustled the trees and the sun streamed down through the canopy, blessing them. The blacksmith's wife dabbed at her eyes. "Never thought I'd see a burlap sack turned into a wedding veil," she sniffled to Mavis. Mavis smiled, a wide, genuine smile. "It's not the sack," she said. "It's what she turned it into." Later that evening, as the stars began to appear in the velvet sky, Annabelle and Silas sat on the porch of their cabin. The veil lay folded in her lap. She ran her fingers over the embroidered flowers. "This thing used to mean everything I feared," she said softly. He looked at her, his heart full. "And now?" She looked up at him, her eyes shining in the twilight. "Now," she said, "it means everything I chose." He reached over, lacing his fingers through hers. Their hands, one calloused and strong from swinging an axe, the other delicate but scarred from fighting for her life, fit together perfectly. They had found peace not by forgetting their past, but by reclaiming it, by turning their scars, both visible and invisible, into symbols of their strength. Their love story wasn't a fairy tale. It was something far more real and far more beautiful. It was a story forged in fire, and it proved that sometimes the most broken things can be put back together to create something stronger than ever before. If this story of survival, justice, and unlikely love captured your imagination, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You won't want to miss the incredible tales we have coming your way. And let us know in the comments below. What was the most shocking twist for you? Until next time, remember that even in the darkest woods, a single flame of courage can light the way home.